Hello. Time flies when you post twice a year. I tried filming earlier this week and it just didn't go well. I think if I learned anything about myself during grad school, it was that I thrive with some structure. So I now have a bullet point list, a sequence of things I want to mention. I can't imagine the algorithm is pushing me out to that many new people, and fair enough. But for context, I'm Jennifer. I was working in publishing before I went to grad school in the fall of 2022. And as of a few weeks ago, I now have a master's in Eastern European Studies. I graduated. And I want to talk about the final wild semester and my thesis, all those types of things. But first, I want to chat books because, yeah, it's been almost 2 years since I had the time and the brain space to read for fun. So let me show you where my mind went when I did have that time. First, I gathered all the unread poetry collections I had. I have some major American classics I've never read from Whitman and Dickinson, a new collection from a poet turned beauty YouTuber. I can link her video on this below. And then I have collections translated from Estonian, Lithuanian, Czech, Polish, Ukrainian, and Russian. I thought poetry would be a good way to ease back into things, and I've since started the Estonian collection, One is None. Then I picked 4 novels from my shelf that were calling to me, and I started with this one, the top one. It's translated from Swedish by Rachel Willson-Broyles, and it's called Stolen. It's about a girl named Elsa who's Sami. Sami are an indigenous people living across northern Scandinavia. Hitting myself in the face, across northern Scandinavia and into part of Russia, which is now even more complicated given the fact that the Russian part of the Sami people came out in favor of Russia's war in Ukraine in 2022. And actually someone in my master's cohort was using this for her thesis, was studying that rift. Anyway, beyond transnational Sami politics, Elsa is part of a family that works as reindeer herders. And as a child, she witnesses the murder of her own reindeer calf by someone outside the community, and the police do nothing about it, and the story progresses from there. I wasn't sure how much I would like this at first. I was sort of questioning the child's perspective. It wasn't totally working for me, but the book did win me over. I would say within about 50 pages. It's really fast-paced, it's dramatic, and I think it does an interesting job of exploring isolated, small-town, intergenerational village life and showing all these fine distinctions about different kinds of insiders and outsiders. At the end of April, Matthew and I went all out for Independent Bookstore Day. Matthew also has a channel where he also barely ever posts. And I ended up with 6 books, 4 of which I bought and 2 of which I won at McNally Jackson. And actually the one that I've now read is The Girls by John Bowen, which has a fantastic description, a wry, macabre tale of simple living, brutal murder, and a reasonably happy couple. It follows 2 women who are partners living together in 1970s England. They live a quiet life in a small town until the day that one of them starts to question why they live the way they do and why she's in this relationship. That psychological moment is portrayed wonderfully. And soon after that point, the other woman gets pregnant. I thought this was really charming. The ending was unnecessary, especially the very last bit. It just didn't really land. But one of the things I loved about this is how accurately it portrays the incompetence of average people who end up involved with murder. I mean, for the typical person who hasn't consistently reinforced their strangest intrusive thoughts through true crime consumption, it would be really hard to keep your cool and plan your next steps in the midst of murder. Like, I am proud to say that I wouldn't handle it well, and neither do these characters. That's my quick reading update. Tomorrow I'm going to the beach for the weekend, and it's going to be an old school, read multiple books over one weekend type of trip. I can feel it. I think I'm going to bring Possession as one of those books because I've never read A.S. Byatt. Scandalous. I myself am scandalized by that. It's a really weird trade-off, though, to have this new freedom because school is over. It was almost certainly my last opportunity to be a full-time student. I took every opportunity that was available to me, and I didn't do that because I felt like I should, or that I was telling myself I would regret it if I didn't. It was just that every bit of it was something I really wanted to do. But I think part of the reason it's been so easy to accept that it's over is that the final semester was, it went from being pleasantly overscheduled to genuinely overwhelming, and I knew it would. I was taking 3 classes: Introductory Hungarian, Advanced Czech, and a history class called Eastern Europe's Cold War. I was working part-time, I was writing my thesis, and I was job searching. No updates yet on that last bit, but let's avoid talking about the fact that my whole future is now a giant gray cloud of nothingness by talking about the past few months. I didn't write a thesis in undergrad. It wasn't required. And honestly, by the time my senior year rolled around, I was just beginning my recovery from neurotic perfectionism. It was a deliberate choice not to do the thesis, actually. I didn't have a specific topic I wanted to research. And I realized my only reason for doing it would be to achieve highest honors, which suddenly wasn't enough motivation on its own. But that meant that I had never done a project of this scale before, and you could really tell. I thought I was doing this very contained thesis, and meanwhile my advisor kept gently saying things like, well, you've really taken on a lot. And he was right. He was right about everything. I ended up having to research 3 mostly independent topics to even get through the introductory portion of my thesis. So basically, I wrote about a Czech literary prize called the Magnesia Litera that was founded in 2002, and the timeline is important there. Fairly quickly, it became the country's most prestigious literary prize. And I knew early on that I wanted to write about the changing role of writers in East Central Europe generally, and of Czech writers specifically, and to tie that in with scholarship on literary prizes. So that was the section I opened with, actually, was on the discourses of literary prizes. And I had 65 typed pages of potential quotes that I had gathered from all my different sources. And that final opening section ended up being something like 13 pages. So I went into certain trends that I noticed in all the conversations happening about literary prizes in this scholarship. So first, there was the idea that there are far too many prizes, that we're just swimming in them. There's also this notion that prizes are agents of consecration. That's one of the terms that's used. They're agents of consecration who bestow cultural value on those who win their awards. And then the name of that prize is supposed to act as a shorthand, a sort of quality label. It was interesting to really think more deeply about all the ways that prizes attach themselves to authors' names and are then used almost as the primary way that we introduce authors in any context, whether that's on the back of the book, in some kind of in-person introduction of an author. People will often just go through a list of prizes. And then in obituaries also, that's a big one, right? This was one of the main texts I used for this portion of the thesis. It's called The Economy of Prestige: Prizes, Awards, and the Circulation of Cultural Value by James F. English. And in this, he talks about like how you would assume, especially based on obituaries, that winning a prize is the only valuable thing that an artist can do to distinguish themselves. And there's the idea that by making art into a competition, into something more like athletics, prizes take this consecrated thing and desecrate it. That's a sort of purity of art argument that I saw a lot. Of course, around the world, a lot of prizes engage in projects of national identity formation or other types of community formation. And then this is another one of the things that was most interesting to me. A lot of the scholarly literature implies that it's natural for writers to need help to raise the profile of their work, that literary work can't effectively reach the public on its own. And what struck me about this in terms of my case study is that this was not at all true of East Central Europe until the 1990s. This baseline assumption was not at all true. All different kinds of literature, and especially what we now deem to be challenging literature, was widely read by the public and was considered relevant. And it was only from the 1990s onward that writers became marginalized to the extent that something like this literary prize, the Magnesia Litera, became really important. Because as I talked about in the thesis, it's, again, a little strange to really grapple with the fact that literary prizes are still one of the only consistently impactful promotional vehicles that we have for books. The second part of my thesis introduction was on the changing role of the Czech national writer from the 19th century up through the 1990s. And one of the main books I used on this is called Remaining Relevant After Communism: The Role of the Writer in Eastern Europe. Essentially, he's arguing that in the 19th century, especially during the period that's referred to as the national revivals in this region, the foundational writers of East Central Europe lent the literary profession a prestige and status unprecedented anywhere else in the world, for their work was seen not simply to have reflected an existing nation, but rather to have created the reality of their nation's existence. There was this role that writers assumed as voices of the nation, the conscience of the nation, and that continued throughout the 20th century into the communist period. That brings me to the third and final part of the introduction to my thesis, which was about the 1990s, because with the Velvet Revolution of 1989, along with everything else, the Czech literary world was thrown into chaos. Obviously, the prevailing financial and logistical realities of publishing were upended. There was an influx of foreign books at the same time that there was an influx of previously suppressed genres more generally, like romance and fantasy and crime novels. That was a big one. Communist authorities had fostered and promoted what they considered to be high, serious literature because they wanted culture to serve an edifying function in society. And so suddenly people had all these other options for what to read. But more than anything about books specifically, suddenly there was just so much more to do in the 90s. There was a lot more general culture to experience in these countries. This is the main point in the early part of my thesis. All these transitions meant that almost overnight, Czech literature went from something that was considered to be relevant to a broad cross-section of society, not just to passionate readers. It was not like a niche thing. It went from that to becoming something that was largely irrelevant, that was no longer perceived as necessary for the Czech nation to maintain its sense of self, right? Then I got into the main portion of my thesis, which was answering the question, how did this literary prize, the Magna Se Litera, build prestige in an era when the status of Czech writers had fallen? Remember that this prize was founded in 2002, so you have all the history of Czech writing up to the 1990s, then the chaos of the 1990s, and then 2002, people are starting to find their footing again, but the literary landscape has just changed irrevocably from what it was before. So in this changed landscape, how do you now promote something that didn't really need to be promoted before? How do you create a buzz around books when books were perfectly capable of creating their own buzz previously? I mean, there was no doubt in the minds of most East Central Europeans that a poem could change the world, that a poem could heavily influence society. And now it was like, who was reading poetry? And believe me, in the thesis, I don't overly romanticize the previous role of East Central European writers either. There's a lot of downsides to writers having this burden of writing their nations into existence. The contemporary Ukrainian writer Oksana Zabushko has some amazing quotes about this, about how from the 1990s onwards, yes, writing was not as popular as it had been previously, but that her generation was the first to not have to experience this burden of like reifying the Ukrainian nation because the Ukrainian nation could exist without their help. I'm feeling very emotional saying that now. Anyway, beyond all of the scholarship I was talking about, the main portion of the thesis on this literary prize relied on three types of sources. One of them was contemporaneous news articles about the prize. I can't even tell you how many Czech language articles I read about this. For those of you who are Czech, I now have an Aspect subscription from this, and just so much Ediness, so much, all the news sites. The second main source was interviews. I went to Prague in January and I conducted interviews with so many different types of literary people. I talked to the prize's founder and he was lovely and incredibly helpful. The translator Alex Zucker also connected me with a lot of these people that I ended up speaking to, and Alex Zucker was great also in his interview. I talked to several Czech editors, authors, literary agents, book critics, former judges of the prize, cultural workers, people trying to promote Czech books internally. Then it turned out that I'd created so much work for myself because I interviewed about 20 people, I think. Most of the interviews were in English, some were in both English and Czech, and some were entirely in Czech. And then I had to transcribe all those interviews, and I ended up with over 200 pages of transcription. And as you would probably guess, like Czech language transcription takes me easily 5 times longer. And then for each quote in the thesis, I was, referencing the timestamp from the interview, and I'd never done anything like that before. And then the final source for the last part of the thesis was the winning fiction books themselves, the 13 books that won some type of fiction prize in the first 10 years. It was important for me in a thesis that was on a literary topic to engage directly with literature and not just have this bird's eye view of it all. And also I wanted to see for myself what it was about these books in the first 10 years that might have made them appealing choices of winners, right? And one of my questions was, what did the judges' choices say, either directly or obliquely, about the new role of writers in the 21st century and what kind of fiction is being recommended to people. But that meant that for these 13 books, most of which were only available in Czech, I ended up reading anywhere from 60 to 120 pages at least, sometimes more, of each one of these books. And then I also read contemporaneous reviews of them, and I typically referenced anywhere from 5 to 8 reviews. So a whole section of my thesis, a whole 13-page section, was 1 page on each of the books where I talked about the author and their regional background and their careers before winning. Then I talked about the book itself and analyzed a little bit about the themes and plots and characters and everything. And then the final portion of each of these 1-page little bits was going through the reviews of the time just to see how these books are being evaluated when they were published. I'm not saying that I had some never before seen level of work or anything, but I do think that because I didn't have a thesis that was kind of pre-structured, that was following one theme in one area of scholarship, because I was bringing several disparate things together, that I did end up having to do a lot of different kinds of legwork. And I loved it. I mean, I didn't love the middle of March to the end of April and just how many hours had to be devoted to this. And I don't like anything cutting into my sleep. I love sleep. But I do still have this affection for my thesis topic. I genuinely think it's so interesting, and in this roundabout way actually says a lot about what we presume is the role of writers in 21st century societies and the ways that essential European writers of previous centuries just defied so many of those stereotypes. I still like thinking about it, and I don't feel this I never want to read that ever again type of aversion to the topic. I'm a little talked out at this point. I know I've gone on and on, so I'll wrap things up by saying that, I really don't know what the future is going to look like. It's very daunting to be rebuilding a life with a new profession, probably in a new city. I've been in New York for 6.5 years. Things feel really transitional and unstable, and such is life. I'm sure many, many of you watching are facing major life transitions. I try to be more excited about it than I am terrified, but I can safely say that regardless of what happens next, that the past years have been special. They've been a special time. They've crystallized a lot of things for me and really showed me why I still have this channel, actually, what it is that I love about pausing in my everyday life and going back to a book that I loved, rereading sections, just thinking it all over again, and then trying to formulate my thoughts into words. I actually have a very clear vision of what I want for this channel going forward, and it's not what it's looked like in the past, except for in certain major types of content. I'll say, I don't even like that word, but I'm talking about the content of the videos, not as though the videos themselves are content or whatever. Yeah, I'll save that discussion for another day. And in the meantime, thank you so much for spending this time with me as I talked about something that's interesting to me and maybe 5 other people on Earth. I hope to be back soon. And in the meantime, take care. And I hope you're reading something you're enjoying.